Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. For today's video, I want to take a break from doing movies and go back to something I haven't really talked about since I first started my channel, and that's just basically a book review. As you could probably maybe not tell, I am a huge Stephen King fan. He is probably my favorite author. I've read a ton of his books. And not only have I read a lot of his books, but I've read a lot of his different paranormal versus non-paranormal stuff as well. And when you read a lot of Stephen King books, you do see a lot of patterns in the way his stories are told, and sort of how things play out in his books are very similar throughout. Some books are very different from others. Some series are sort of more like fantasy-based versus horror-based. And he's still writing books today, so it's not like there's going to ever be a shortage of Stephen King things to read. But I wanted to talk about my personal favorite book of his. And like most of his books, this one has also been made into a movie adaptation. I have thought about doing a video as well comparing the book to the movie, but right now I just want to talk about the book. And the book I specifically want to talk about, which is my favorite Stephen King book, is Misery. Misery came out in June 8th of 1987, and it is the 25th novel Stephen King has published. And for anyone who hasn't read this book, I'll give you sort of a quick summary. It's about a writer named Paul Sheldon who, while driving drunk, does get into a car accident and flips his vehicle. He is found and rescued by a woman named Annie Wilkes, who turns out to also be Paul Sheldon's #1 fan. And in this book, Paul Sheldon is writing a series of books based around a character named Misery. And the Misery series is sort of like a mystery novel. Misery is the main character throughout the books, and Paul is sort of ready to step out of that sort of mystery genre and kind of start a new career in writing. So he starts to work on the last Misery book, which will end up killing off her character, officially ending the series. Now, while Paul is recovering at Annie's house, she does find the final manuscript, Misery's Child, and reads it and is just angered by the fact that Paul is killing Misery and this is the last book. She finds it completely unacceptable and starts basically using her caretaking abilities to make Paul rewrite the story. He got really injured during that car accident. He's got broken legs, probably broken ribs. His whole body's just sort of beat up and sore. He's kind of disoriented and tired. And she's taking care of him. She was a nurse, so she has the ability to help kind of bring him back to health, but she refuses to take him to a hospital or really alert anyone that she even found Paul. And instead, she uses her own supply of medicine to keep his pain levels kind of down low. She starts working on restructuring his legs. She can, splints them and gets him sort of to a makeshift cast. But because she is so angry with how he ends the Misery series, she starts to withhold the medicine and start pressing on the pain points in his body, basically telling him, if you don't rewrite the story, you're never getting out of here. So she gets him an old typewriter, sits him down in front of a desk in a wheelchair, and tells him to start writing. So Paul has to basically write against his will for a character that he was trying to kill off. And over the course of a few weeks, he does find that it's easy to write about Misery. She is a comforting character for him. He knows her backstory and how to write for her. He was sort of struggling writing his new series. It was something that was out of his element and he wasn't sure was going to be received well. But as time goes on, he also starts to get more and more suspicious of Annie. She still has yet to alert anyone that Paul is there, so no one knows where he is or can get a hold of him. And she starts to really withhold his medicine whenever he does anything she doesn't like. If he doesn't want to write one day, she holds the medicine for a day. And he's got 2 horribly broken legs. He is in constant pain. He's not been to an actual hospital and gotten himself taken care of, so he starts to really rely on that medicine to just give him a sort of regular mindset. So he is starting to develop an addiction to these opioids, along with being held captive by this crazy woman. And Annie gets a little bit slack with her security with Paul as time goes on, and one day while she's out, Paul starts to search around her house. He's been confined to one room in a wheelchair for the majority of his stay, so he starts to wheel himself around the upstairs and starts to kind of find things throughout the house that are raising suspicions on Annie. Most damning is the scrapbook he finds that has articles on different people who were found dead. And with the power of deduction, Paul's able to figure out that Annie has killed her neighbors, her family, a few other families, and she also was killing people when she was a nurse at the hospitals. She'd only stayed at hospitals for short periods of time and was constantly switching jobs because she was one of those nurses who, whenever elderly people were sort of towards the end of their life, she would just help them get there. Annie even had to go to court at one point because 11 infant newborn babies had ended up dying under her care, which raised suspicions. But Annie was so good at moving jobs and states and constantly being on the move that no one really caught up with everything that she was doing. But Paul is now terrified because not only has she already been a crazy fan and threatening to hurt him if he doesn't write the perfect story, but now he has confirmation that she is willing to do terrible things to people. Paul does eventually finish the new Misery novel, which Annie tells him this is perfect, your best writing yet, this is going to be the best book, it's going to sell out, and she is encouraging him to still publish this book, but he also has the sense that she's not going to really let him get out of here. He's starting to accept that he's most likely not going to leave her house alive. But eventually, police do find their way to Annie's house. They have been looking for Paul this whole time. It's been months by this point that he's been missing. And Annie ends up killing the police officer that shows up to her house by running over his head with a lawnmower. But of course, the police officer doesn't come back after going to Annie's house, which just brings more police officers there, and Paul takes this opportunity to kind of set a trap for Annie and really escape because he knew she's not going down without a fight and she most likely is going to kill Paul before she goes after these police officers. So he takes a fake stack of papers, puts the new Misery cover over top of those, and then basically tricks Annie into thinking that he sets the new manuscript on fire. And this was typed up on a typewriter, there's no other copy, so Annie starts to panic and go after the manuscript. Paul is able to attack her, knocks her unconscious, and is able to escape out of the barn into the arms of the police officers, and he does eventually escape. Annie succumbs to her injuries and is pronounced dead. And kind of the whole thing is just a bad dream for Paul in the end. He suffers a lot with PTSD and addiction afterwards. He does publish the final Misery novel, which gets a ton of super great reviews because of the story behind it. He was held captive while he wrote it. And he's plagued with just nightmares, and he's got terrible writer's block afterwards. And it takes him a long time to recover from the mental damage, not only the physical, but the mental damage that Annie kind of put on him. But he does eventually sort of get back to normal. He's got a prosthetic leg that he's able to maneuver with, and he gets over that writer's block and is able to kind of move past the Misery era of his life. Now, like I said, this book came out in 1987, and for those of you who may not know, the first 25 to 30 novels that Stephen King wrote, he wrote under heavy alcohol and drug addiction. King had already been suffering with alcoholism even before he became a big writer, and then the more popular his stories became, the easier access he had to drugs such as LSD and cocaine really became a crutch for him, and he even said that there were days where he was only sober for about 3 hours. And he did so much cocaine that he literally had to stuff cotton balls up his nose to keep the blood from dripping onto his typewriter. Because I wasn't able to find an exact date whenever King really turned his life around, but his family staged an intervention for him in the late 1980s. He had a couple of fall-offs, it's never a first clean start, but he was able to recover from that, and he has now been decades sober. And although everything I found really just says the late 80s is whenever he really became sober, this book came out in 1987, so I feel like it might have been towards the end of that addiction into the recovery part of Stephen King's life. And the reason I say that is because this book feels very real in the struggles that Paul goes through with this opioid addiction. And not only that, but this book, unlike some of his other things, has a layer of realism that a lot of his other stories don't have. Books that came out before this, such as Carrie, It, The Shining, they are real life settings but with kind of paranormal, supernatural elements to them. And a lot of his stories are like that, where they sort of start more just normal, kind of average, regular people who just kind of stumble into something supernatural or paranormal. But this book has none of that. It's a very, very plausible situation that could occur, which I think just helps not only the believability, but the scariness behind it. King sort of calls this book a love letter to his fans. In 1984, Stephen King came out with a book called The Eyes of the Dragon, which was not really received well from his fan base. We'd been so used to seeing horror coming out of this man, to see something that was sort of fantasy, whimsical, was just really out of nowhere for a lot of people, and a lot of people did not like it. So this was King's first encounter with sort of being stuck in that horror genre. He had just made such a name for himself for something that he was really good at doing, it made it harder for him to be able to branch out and try something new. And at this stage in life, he was also a popular enough author that he was getting crazy fans writing to him, approaching him, and it was sort of all of this accompanied with this addiction that he was going through and trying to recover from that really inspired him to write this story. Annie's character herself came to him in a dream that he kind of wrote it down, but he was already planning on writing sort of this story about the crazed fan who catches a writer. And the book does a really good job at kind of showing these different stages. The addicted writer who's going through kind of his own personal things. Paul had been going through writer's block. People weren't receiving his new stuff as well. The crazy fan who's going through her own mental sort of disadvantages, and she herself is a representation of how kind of crazy and hectic that fandom can become and how people can get so disconnected with everything. And then it also is just a really good story on just mental stability and the strength of the human psyche, with not only being able to commit horrible crimes and acts on people without feeling remorse, but also being able to withstand horrible things being done to you. And I think because a lot of that was stuff King was personally experiencing in life at that moment, that's why this book feels so authentic and scary and real to me, because it feels like definitely something that he's gone through. He can really write from that perspective of someone who's going through withdrawals of drug addiction, of someone who's kind of scared for their life because a crazy fan is doing something that's making them feel like their life is in danger. King has said, obviously, nothing he's encountered has been this dramatic, but he has always kind of struggled with mental health issues, especially when he was younger. He was a very anxious and overwhelmed kid. That's a big reason why he started writing horror stories, was to sort of purge all of the things that scared him. He felt better after writing about things that scared him. And this was something that was starting to become a real reality to him, is that there's a chance that there is a fan out there that's crazy, obsessed with him enough that they would harm or kill him if given the opportunity. And I'm not going to say that there was like fear within this story, but you can definitely tell this is something that King has thought through, and it's something that's on his mind. And not only that, but nurse or doctor serial killers are a thing, and it's an unfortunately kind of easy thing for them to be able to get away with. There are other stories that you can look up of doctors and nurses who worked in like hospice or elderly homes, and that would have an unusual amount of their patients just pass away from whatever they were suffering from. And those people usually get away with it for years. So having someone like Annie exist is not that far off. There are people who worked in hospitals for years that were slyly killing their patients without anyone being the wiser. So pair that like really actual serial killer aspect to this sort of like drug addicted, crazy fan scenario, it really creates a compelling story. And I think the fact that there is no supernatural elements to it, it makes it feel like that this is definitely something that could happen. Obviously, there are parts that are more exaggerated, and it wouldn't play out exactly as it does in his book, but it has great, just naturally scary elements to it. Now, don't get me wrong, books even after this are still just as gross and gruesome, but there is something about the writing style of this book in particular that I really feel like you can tell it came from a more personal angle. King always says that you can't write without some part of it being about you, but he does say that the character of Paul and the sort of situation Paul was in does hold a little bit more of that realism to him, because it was a bigger reflection than he realized of what he was going through at the time. But the book is beautifully written in my opinion. I love the way the story flows. There isn't really a time where it's too slow. It's actually one of the smaller Stephen King books. A lot of his books are much more detailed and in-depth and take place over a longer period of time. Even ones that take place in a shorter period of time sometimes have way more detail to them. But this is definitely one of his shorter books, but I feel like one of his more successful ones. It's definitely one I recommend you read if you haven't. And the movie adaptation is still just as good. Kathy Bates is in it, and how can you not love her as Annie? Like, she just plays the character so well. But yeah, this is a book I've read multiple times, and it's one of my favorites of his, and probably will still remain my favorite. There are a couple other of his stories that I do really, really love, but there's something about just the realism of this book, and you can really feel the pain that Stephen King was going through whenever he wrote this book. It was a hard time in his life for sure. This book also has my favorite author photo of him of all time. I mean, like, how great and ridiculous is this picture? But if you guys have read Misery, I'd love to know what you think. Do you think it's one of his better works, or do you like some of his more horror, paranormal, supernatural style? And if you have read the book and seen the movie, which one's your favorite? I definitely want to make a video about both of those as well, kind of comparing them. So I'll probably do that in the future. But in the meantime, I'd love to know your thoughts. You can leave a comment down below or head over to my Instagram, What a Horror. I'll be making a post about this video as well. But as always, I want to thank you guys so much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you want to see new videos, because I put out new videos every other Friday currently. Fingers crossed that that won't have to be for too much longer. But until next time, stay spooky.